Maybe not everyone's favorite topic. It's nicer to be talking about, thiols and terpenes and all the things that we really want to get out of our beers. But it's also important to understand off flavors, some of the common root causes of them, and how to prevent them. And surprise, surprise, it's probably going to come down to yeast health. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about how to make sure your fancy IPA doesn't taste disgusting, basically. We're going to talk about controlling and mitigating acetaldehyde, sulfur, fusels, diacetyl, as well as phenols. And we'll cover a couple others less common off flavors as well. Okay, so I got something here for each one. Acetaldehyde, how do you like them apples? I don't like it very much. Acetaldehyde is an off flavor that's pretty common in beers that have stressed fermentations. In terms of a flavor impact, that's going to cause your beer to taste like green apple is like the common descriptor, or underripe apples. That's true in light beers like light lager and things like that, Hellas. In a beer that isn't a light beer, like a dark beer or something with a little bit other stuff going on, you might get more of like a pumpkin or squash like character. That like fresh cut pumpkin certainly does have some of those like aldehyde flavor notes. So that's the reason for that association. Same thing with avocado or grassy, or even might taste like overripe fruit. So it doesn't taste like green apple to everyone, although that's the common association because of like green apple flavoring having acetaldehyde. But it does come across differently to different people and in different contexts. So that's important to keep it in mind. It is almost always present in beer at low quantities, but usually below detectable levels. If it's above those levels, that's where it can start to become unpleasant. So that tends to be in the 1 to 15 parts per million range. So quite similar to a lot of the esters, for example, in terms of how sensitive we are to those compounds in the beer. Yeah, acetaldehyde, bit of an overview there. How is it made? And I think the story we're going to see with a lot of the off flavors is, number one, these are really hard to avoid because they are normal parts of yeast doing yeast things, normal parts of yeast metabolism. In the case of acetaldehyde, it's made as part of the process from breaking down sugar and making alcohol, which is one of the things that we've essentially hired our yeast to do, right? Take the sugar, make the alcohol. Good deal. Acetaldehyde is basically the last step in that process. So by the time the yeast has got to that stage, in some cases it's a little bit tired, right? So if you have residual acetaldehyde in the beer, that often means that the beer has seen an incomplete fermentation, right? It hasn't fully converted all of those intermediates into ethanol, alcohol. We're getting a little bit more into the biochemistry here. So if we're looking at, how actually is acetaldehyde both made and reduced, we have two key factors here that help us to actually complete that conversion of acetaldehyde into ethanol. So that header at the top should say, how is ethanol made? From acetaldehyde, we basically need to turn acetaldehyde into our alcohol, or ethanol, right? So that's done through an enzyme called ADH, or alcohol dehydrogenase. And what's also important here is that zinc, we've talked about zinc in our yeast nutrition topic. That is important here as well. Zinc is actually a cofactor in that enzyme. That enzyme uses zinc as part of its active site to do this work of turning acetaldehyde into ethanol, alcohol. It also requires, and this is, I think, also something that we've talked about before here, the enzyme cofactor NADH. You might remember that from our Brett talk. Also important in yeast metabolism, especially when there's no oxygen around. So those two things are both required for this enzyme to work. And when that enzyme works, it turns acetaldehyde into alcohol. So that's something to keep in mind. If this enzyme doesn't have what it needs to work, this enzyme that's made by yeast, then it won't, and you're going to end up with residual acetaldehyde in your beer. So then how is it broken down? So this is just another way of looking at that pathway. We've kind of simplified things here, but we're looking at the last few steps here on the left-hand side. Pyruvate turned into acetaldehyde. That's also where we're getting our CO2 in our beer. And then acetaldehyde being turned into ethanol. And it is a bit of a virtuous cycle because that breakdown of sugar is helping us to generate ATP, that energy currency of the cell, which we've talked about before in yeast nutrition, as well as regenerating that NADH, which the yeast needs for that final step in the process. So that's a critical part as well. It all just sort of speaks to the fact that there is this fine balance with metabolism in the yeast. And if our cells are not healthy, at the end of the day, we might not end up getting full conversion of acetaldehyde into ethanol. Essentially, looking upstream, we need a healthy fermentation process and healthy yeast cells to ensure that we actually get that complete conversion. So where are areas we're going to see acetaldehyde problems? Number one is where we have poor wort nutrition, because if we don't have an adequate nutrition in the wort, we're not going to get enough yeast cells. They're going to be a little bit more stressed out, and they're not going to be able to do the work towards the tail end of the fermentation in order to convert that acetaldehyde into ethanol. So that's one typical problem area. If the wort doesn't have enough free amino nitrogen, if it doesn't have enough oxygen, if it doesn't have enough zinc or other minerals, that can be a root cause. Another problem area is in intentionally slow or low temperature ferments like lagers, simply because you're inducing a slower fermentation overall. So if you have a slower fermentation overall, you might also notice that acetaldehyde more as well. In some ale ferments, it's done so fast you don't even notice it. With lagers, you probably will notice that. In some cases, a little bit at the end of the ferment or tail end of the ferment is acceptable, and lagering can help, the yeast age out and metabolize that acetaldehyde. If you still have some active yeast in the tail end of the lager fermentation or the lagering process, it can certainly break down some residual acetaldehyde into ethanol. But that is a potential problem area, especially if the yeast doesn't get the nutrition it needs. It's going to struggle to break that down. And some strains are more prone than others as well. So some strains will give you more of that sort of green apple character than others on the lager side. With IPAs, one problem area to look for is dry hopping, because this could be a whole webinar on its own, and probably should be. Dry hopping can cause what's called hop creep, which basically is a little bit of added fermentation from enzymes coming off the hops, causing a little bit of residual breakdown of starches and dextrins, and therefore a little bit of a secondary fermentation in the beer. If you have this secondary fermentation and it's already a stressful environment for the yeast, it's an IPA, it might be higher alcohol. There's a lot of hops in there. Generally just a stressful environment for the yeast. That can also cause issues, because you might get an incomplete ferment with hop creep, and that can cause, not only acetaldehyde, but we'll also talk about diacetyl as well, and that's another risk. So those dry hop beers are a challenge. So unfortunately, lagers are very popular, IPAs are very popular. Those are two of the higher risk beers with your acetaldehyde. It's going to be less of an issue if you're making a brown ale or something like that. And then pressurized ferments, that's also a risk. So I know it's really, really popular, especially on the homebrew side, but also in, professional brewing, doing pressurized ferments, either the full way through or, pressurizing the fermentation towards the tail end, otherwise known as spunding. But something to keep in mind is that CO2 is going to increase in the beer during that fermentation. And it is a little bit toxic to the yeast. So it might slow it down or inhibit the fermentation. And that's another way that you could potentially get more acetaldehyde. The way that you can control for this with a pressurized ferment is to make very sure that the yeast gets enough oxygen up front to grow and the right amount of nutrition, including both FAN as well as the key minerals like zinc and magnesium. Another problem area for acetaldehyde that you might not see with some of the other off flavors is overpitching. So overpitching yeast repeatedly can result in acetaldehyde issues due to nutrient limitations. So when we're pitching twice as many cells, for example, each of those cells, it's not getting as much of the oxygen you put in. It's not getting as much of the nutrients you put in. You often get an older overall pool of yeast cells. It tends to result in a less metabolically active yeast pitch. And so you're just getting less of those key nutrients per cell, which might mean that it's overall less effective at breaking down the acetaldehyde. So certain ale strains, when they're overpitched, and we've seen that with Kolsch yeasts in particular, if those are overpitched repeatedly, you can get some issues with that green apple acetaldehyde flavor. So yeah, there's a few different ways we can control it. Just to summarize, making sure that the yeast gets enough resources, including all of the key nutrients like our oxygen, as well as our nutrients that we can just sprinkle into our wort, like our zinc and free amino nitrogen, and sources of those nutrients like yeast lightning. Those will help to reduce the risk of acetaldehyde. And the other key part here is that if you're repitching the yeast, we do recommend counting the yeast and not over pitching, because that can be a potential cause of this off flavor. Okay, so we're going to move on to sulfur. So what is sulfur? And I'm really talking about a couple things here. But in general, sulfur is an off flavor that's common in beers that have stressed, what I'll call stressed fermentations. The main compounds that we're talking about when we're talking about sulfur are hydrogen sulfide, or H2S, and sulfur dioxide, or SO2. They are very different from each other, so it's important to keep that in mind. If you have a sulfur problem, be specific about what it is you're dealing with. Hydrogen sulfide is the classic, like, cooked eggs, that sort of eggy, sulfury smell. And if you need a flavor standard for that, or need to understand what it is I'm talking about, you can just overcook some hard-boiled eggs, and you will immediately know what H2S smells like when you cut that open. Sulfur dioxide, a little bit more fleeting, but kind of smells like a struck match. It kind of is that, like, it's always described as matchstick or flinty. It also is sulfury in a different way. In some cases, both of these can be pleasant if they're in harmony with other aromas. But one of the challenges is that we are extremely sensitive to these. The detection threshold is about 100 times lower than, for example, the acetaldehyde. We can detect these with really, really high sensitivity. So if there's a lot of either of these in a beer, we tend to find it unbalanced and unpleasant. A little bit's nice. Like in traditional German lagers, for example, you're going to have a little bit of both, and it can actually add complexity to the flavor profile of the beer. But too much is typically unpleasant. There's going to be a lot of common themes here of, off flavors are kind of just a product of the general nature of our yeast doing what it needs to do. Sulfur is typically made by yeast as a response to a low nutrient environment. So once again, sort of low nutrient starvation environment is going to cause the yeast to produce off flavors. It's really a byproduct of the yeast having to work harder to make its own, in this case, its own amino acids. So if we look at the pathway, there will be pathways. We can see, for example, in this case, the yeast, if it needs to make a sulfur-containing amino acid like cysteine or methionine, and it's not just given those building blocks through a yeast nutrient, it's going to have to do some work. And part of doing that work is going to involve the production of hydrogen sulfide and SO2. So that is how these often end up in your beer. Oftentimes, this metabolism is not like perfectly efficient. So even if the yeast is able to do what it needs to do and make its cysteine and methionine amino acids, it's probably going to leave behind some other, volatile sulfury compounds like these as well. So one key way to reduce this is to make sure that the yeast has what it needs. So making sure that it has the amino acids it needs, that can be addressed through yeast nutrients. So a yeast nutrient that has free amino nitrogen rather than just something like DAP is going to help. So like a yeast nutrient based on yeast extracts, for example, or any other complex source of free amino nitrogen will typically work better here than something that's based on just straight ammonium. So not all nutrients are built the same. It's important to know what you're working with, and a complex nutrient will help here, as will making a wort that is higher in nutrition, higher in FAN, for example. So just sort of digging into those specific flavors, that SO2 is usually indicates restricted yeast growth or not enough nutrient. It can also be an issue with recurrent yeast repitching. If that yeast is repeatedly starved, it's going to repeatedly have to make its own sulfur-containing amino acids. And typically the way to address this is to give the yeast both more oxygen and more free amino nitrogen. That usually results in less SO2. Some lager brewers will actually reduce their dissolved oxygen in the wort to increase the SO2 because it does have some nice oxygen scavenging properties in the beer. Right, it is an antioxidant, so it's if you've really got your stuff dialed in, you can use oxygen to control the SO2 amount in your final beer. And help to give it a little bit of antioxidant as it proceeds through, anything that's going to expose it to oxygen, like packaging. But there are also other ways to control oxygen beyond that, and too much of that is going to be, considered an off flavor in a lot of beer styles. On the other hand, our H2S, which is our sort of farty, sulfury, eggy aroma, that can also that can result from underpitching yeast because the yeast is going to have to work harder. Each cell is going to have to work harder to make those amino acids for itself, which the net result is more H2S. Same thing if there's not enough free amino nitrogen, especially those sulfur-containing amino acids like cysteine and methionine. Yeast is going to make more of them and make more H2S. Another issue can be excessive yeast growth, but I would say only under the condition of not enough nutrient. If you've got lots of yeast growth, but with the support of adequate nutrition, then sulfur should be less of an issue. But it can be associated with faster ferments. The classic scenario that I'll say for H2S is Belgian yeasts, which are some of the highest nutrient requirements. And you can go and check out our webinar on yeast nutrition for all the details there. But classic scenario is, fermenting a Belgian strain in a wort that doesn't have enough nutrient for it, doesn't have enough FAN, and letting that fermentation free rise. That's basically a recipe for sulfur. So, and then you have to wait for that to age out or play around with mitigation methods for the sulfur. So one way to easily address that is to make sure that that Belgian yeast gets the nutrient that it needs. So yeah, where are the problem areas? Wort nutrition is the key one here. Making sure that the wort has adequate FAN levels, especially for those Belgian strains or any high FAN requiring strain. I'm like calling out Belgian strains because a lot of them are quite high, but that also includes some British ale strains, some Kvike, etc., and even lager, right? Lager strains tend to have low nutrient requirements, but if they don't get enough, they don't get enough, and they're going to give you a lot of sulfur if they're not getting enough nutrition. And making sure that that nutrition that you're adding includes a balanced mix of free amino acids is really important as well, right? If the yeast is able to get the cysteine and methionine, it's not going to have to make them, and that's usually going to mean less of that sulfur. A problem area is slow and low ferments, so it's going to emerge as a theme as well. As more brewers are making lager beers, we're going to run into more of those potential challenges as an industry. That being said, sulfur is, in some ways beneficial or expected in lagers. It's just a matter of balance. The lagering process, just like with acetaldehyde, can help us age out and metabolize sulfur. Those are the first compounds to oxidize. Those are the first compounds to flash off. So you can get rid of them. You can also get rid of sulfur compounds through chemical reactions. So there are products available that contain copper. Copper reacts with and oxidizes those sulfur, those volatile sulfur compounds, and reduces their flavor impact. So that's another option as well. You know, the classic story of, you know, a home brewer sticking a copper pipe in their fermenter when it's sulfury, or a brewery, you know, transferring their beer through a little piece of copper pipe in a loop to reduce sulfur is absolutely true. Like that is effective. Copper ions are effective at reducing sulfur. So that's another way that you can mitigate it. Another cause of sulfur issues is underpitching, because you're basically making a smaller number of yeasts work harder to grow, and so you're going to end up with more synthesis, usually of those sulfur-containing amino acids. And then another area that I think is worth looking at and just trying to find the right balance is trub carryover or trub settling, or flotation before fermentation. So I know this is starting to become a trendy thing as more pro brewers, especially here in North America, are getting into lagers and, you know, using some of the European lager production techniques. You know, one technique to improve beer clarity downstream is to remove as much trub as possible prior to fermentation. So that can be done through different methods. One common one is just letting the wort settle in a settling tank before actually moving it to the fermentation tank. Another more practical method might be putting the wort in the tank, pitching the yeast, but then doing what's called cone shaving after 24 hours, for example. So basically removing any of the settled trub in the tank. And those can have benefits both in terms of flavor, in terms of flavor stability, because trub can contain fatty acids that can be oxidation positive. That being said, the trub is also where some of your nutrition is going to be, right? Especially some of those sulfur-containing amino acids. So it's a bit of a fine balance in terms of ensuring that the yeast has everything it needs against, you know, downstream flavor stability as well. So my recommendation there would be what I have heard of a number of brewers doing is, if you're going to do cone shaving to remove trub, just do it after 24 hours. That way your yeast has had opportunity to take up whatever nutrition it needs from the trub, and you can still get it out of the fermenter. So that is an option. I know that's becoming common both in IPAs and also in lagers. All right, so that's sulfur. That one bugs me a lot because it's pretty easy to fix both upstream and downstream. So it's completely you know, not really necessary to show up in abundance in any finished beer. Fusels are a little bit more tricky, so we're going to get into those. They're a bit of a headache. So what are fusels? Also known as higher alcohols or fusel oils. Fusel alcohols tend to give the perception of boozy, like hot, burning alcohol, that kind of flavor that's associated with, you know, the cheap whiskey that you drink in, you know, first year university or whatever. They are a natural byproduct of fermentation. You know, yeast, usually we're looking for ethanol alcohol, but in that process, you know, metabolism's messy. So yeast is also going to make some other stuff. It's also going to make fusels and other byproducts as a result. You know, a lot of the flavor that we get in our beer is a result of the messiness of yeast metabolism, and that includes fusels. They're also important because they're an important precursor for many desirable flavor compounds, including esters. So that's important to keep in mind as well. They're not always undesirable. Fusels are always present in low quantities in beer. Almost always you can measure these things, but they're typically below detectable thresholds in healthy fermentations. When they go above the detectable threshold, that's when these start to be perceived as boozy and unpleasant, and they can even give us a bit of a headache sometimes as well, right? That's part of why they're undesirable. Both fusels and acetaldehyde can actually like give you a headache after drinking, or, you know, contribute to the severity of your hangover. So, you know, they're really important in terms of, you know, not only flavor but also health. So how are they formed? The same old story. You know, yeast is trying to do something else. They end up making this stuff. In this case, the yeast is just moving some building blocks around. So fusels are formed as a result of breakdown of amino acids. Maybe that yeast needs to take one type of amino acid and turn it into a different one. At the end of that process, you're going to often end up with a higher alcohol or a fusel. So you often have the yeast, okay, it's got like one amino acid, it's going to break it down so it can make another amino acid or some DNA or other stuff. But that waste product is also broken down. That alpha keto acid is going to be broken down, and usually the end result is either an aldehyde or a higher alcohol. So either way, that can be unpleasant. The higher alcohols, as I said, are that sort of boozy character. Those aldehydes, as a result of amino acid breakdown, are also relevant. I've heard this from a few pro breweries asking questions about getting like a melon flavor mid fermentation. Some of these fusel aldehydes or intermediate products can kind of give you a bit of a melon-like flavor, and especially when that's coupled with the acetaldehyde with that pumpkin-like flavor, both of which are aldehyde fermentation intermediates. Can be considered unpleasant. And I know that just like with diacetyl or acetaldehyde, clearing up that melon flavor can slow down the overall process of finishing the beer. So if you've ever experienced that, that's what's going on. So how do we control fusels knowing this? And it's tricky because actually, in this case, with amino acids, it's like too much of a good thing is a problem. Too little of a good thing is also a problem. We actually need to strike that right balance with fusels and try to dial in our fan to what the yeast actually needs. So if there's too much fan, we're basically going to have too much amino acids converted to other stuff potentially, usually as a result of excessive yeast growth. And so then they're going to get converted into, those byproducts are going to be converted into new fusel alcohols. So one of the solutions there is that if you're brewing a high gravity beer, you can swap some of the malt for sugar or a lower fan adjunct. What's an example? Like honey or something like that. That would allow you to keep the amount of fan at the level where the yeast needs it, but not so that it's excessive, where you're getting a lot of production of fusels. Another option with higher gravity beers is extended boils. So as you get those Maillard reactions, so you can think of the case of like stouts or barley wines or bière de garde. What is the Maillard reaction? You're taking an amino acid, it's reacting with a sugar and making a flavor or browning byproduct. So that process actually consumes amino acids. So extended boiling with those high gravity beers, that's another way to actually control your fan and control the amount of fusels as well. So, if you're getting fusels off your imperial stout, one actual solution would be to boil it for longer, for example, or cut some of the fermentables with sugar that doesn't have a fan contribution. So you see that a lot in Belgian brewing. Some of the fermentables, Bill, will be simple sugars. So then they're able to produce a beer with a relatively, normal turnaround time that isn't super, super boozy and is, really balanced and flavorful. On the other hand, too little fan can also cause fusel problems because you're going to get more biosynthesis of amino acids, for example, or just of yeast in general. That can also cause some issues, right? You're putting more stress through the yeast, so there's more chance of some of these byproducts of metabolism. So, for example, if you're brewing a low gravity or a standard gravity wort, you need to make sure that it has complete yeast nutrient, right? So that it's not having to, for example, catabolize a bunch of amino acids to make the proteins that it needs. If it just has the amino acids that it needs without having to do all of this extra work, it's going to just use them as is, and your end result is going to be lower fusel formation. So with those worts where you don't have enough nitrogen or enough free amino nitrogen, it helps to bump that up with something like yeast lightning or any other complex nutrient, so that your yeast not only has those amino acid building blocks it needs, but also any of the other essential cofactors for health. So you'll see all these things in our webinar series are tying together, right? All of that information about yeast health and FAN is tying in here, right? In terms of controlling our off flavors. What else impacts fusels? Temperature. So in general, higher temperatures lead to more fusels. So that's something to watch out for and control. Trub, once again, plays a pretty big role overall in off flavors. So if you have more trub in the wort, that usually means you have more protein, more free amino nitrogen. That's usually going to result in a faster fermentation, and faster, in this case, more breakdown of those amino acids, which can potentially lead to more fusels. So that's one way to control fusels, is the trub. So you can see, once again, it's a bit of a balancing act, right? You don't want too much, because that can cause issues with fusels. You don't want too little, because that can cause issues with sulfur, right? So it's all about finding the right balance for your yeast. And dissolve CO2. This is one that actually might be beneficial. If you have a pressure fermentation, it can often restrict fusel formation. But one of the challenges here is that if you're getting fusels, one of the other ways that we can actually mitigate fusels is through turning them into esters. That alcohol that we end up with, if the yeast has the other parts it needs, it can turn that into an ester. And so some of those are really, really nice ester compounds. Like, that's how you get some of your like banana or strawberry kind of ester aromas. But under CO2 pressure, you usually have a suppression of ester formation. So dissolve CO2 through pressure fermentation or spunding, it can also potentially increase fusels or keep them around because they're not breaking down, but it can also restrict them up front. So I know that's one of the benefits to pressure fermenting on the homebrew side, is keeping the fusels out of the way. But keep in mind that if you do get fusels, dissolved CO2 is not your friend in terms of making esters. Okay, we're going to move on to diacetyl, or the oops all butter. I'm sure everyone out here has had an oops all butter beer at some point, and it's usually pretty unpleasant and, you know, best avoided, I think. So diacetyl. I know we've covered it a lot in our webinars at Escarpment Labs. So if you want to learn more, you can always go and check out our past webinars, our blog and knowledge base, but I do have some info here as well. So diacetyl is one of the most common beer off flavors. For most people, it shows up as a buttery, a popcorn, or a butterscotch-like flavor, and is typically undesirable. A little bit might be considered appropriate for certain English ales or Czech lagers, things like that. But for most people, if there's too much of it, it's pretty unpleasant. And one of the challenges with diacetyl also is that there's a pretty wide range in thresholds. So, you know, what one person might think is disgusting, another person can barely perceive. So that's one of the challenges here, is that each person's sense perception's a little bit different. So consequently, it's really hard to, you know, say what is an acceptable level of diacetyl, what is not. You know, for some people, they cannot stand any at all. For other people, you know, they're pretty blind to it. So, you know, I for example, myself, I'm fairly blind to it, but I don't want it in my beer because I know that some people are sensitive to it, and it's gonna, you know, throw off the experience for them. How does it work? Yeast makes this thing called alpha-acetolactate as the yeast cells grow. So that is an intermediate from the yeast needing to make valine. So once again, we're talking about amino acids. They're pretty critical in all of these off-flavor discussions, free amino nitrogen. In this case, the yeast is making alpha-acetolactate as a precursor for making valine, which is an amino acid that the yeast will need to make its various proteins and enzymes. That alpha-acetolactate, usually because yeast metabolism is not 100% efficient, some of that's going to be made in excess, and it's going to get secreted into the beer. It's going to leave the yeast cell. What happens then is that over time, that alpha-acetolactate, either through oxidation or through temperature and time, it's going to convert into diacetyl. So alpha-acetolactate is flavorless. Diacetyl's not. That's what tastes like butter and butterscotch. So once that alpha-acetolactate is converted to diacetyl, healthy yeast cells, if they're still around in the beer, they'll take it up. They'll reabsorb it like a sponge, and they'll actually break that down to this other compound called 2,3-butanediol, or acetoin is another one. Both of those are lower flavor impact. So the end result there is that yeast can actually reduce this flavor if it's healthy. So when you hear someone talk about a diacetyl rest, that's what's going on is we're giving the yeast time at the end of fermentation to absorb that diacetyl, break it down, so that we don't have that in our beer when we go and we carbonate it and serve it. So what causes diacetyl issues? There's a few different things. So knowing that this is a process that the yeast is basically doing at the end of the fermentation and that it takes time, what can cause this? Number one is fermentation cooled too soon. If you've got alpha-acetolactate in the beer or diacetyl in the beer and you cool it too soon, you're going to crash out your yeast, you're going to slow down your yeast metabolism, and it's not going to be able to take up that diacetyl. Also, if the beer is cooled, the alpha-acetolactate is not going to convert into diacetyl to be absorbable by the yeast. So you kind of have a double whammy in this case, which is why this is one of the major root causes. Cooling the beer too soon or kind of rushing the process. If the yeast is unhealthy, and again, fermentation's hard for the yeast. If it's unhealthy by the end of the ferment, it's not going to be able to take up diacetyl from the beer. So that's going to be an issue as well, especially if it's low viability, right? Dead cells, they're not going to do this. They're not functional sponges. I'm going to keep beating the dead horse here, but incomplete yeast nutrition, that's going to cause problems, right? In this case, if the yeast doesn't get enough free amino nitrogen, it's going to have to make more valine. It's going to have to make more of that amino acid. And therefore, because alpha-acetolactate is a intermediate in that process, we're going to risk more diacetyl production. Again, if a beer is, if the diacetyl is not fully reuptaken by the yeast and the beer contains a lot of alpha-acetolactate and it's held warm, you're going to just get that conversion to diacetyl. So this does happen enough times that I've heard of a beer tastes fine, packaged, and then it's sitting on the shelf, and then as soon as it's sitting on the shelf, it tastes like butter. This is probably what's happened here. There's a really, really easy way for you to check for this. You can accelerate this process through what's called the forced diacetyl test, where you just warm up your beer to 50 Celsius, cool it back down to room temperature, and taste it. You're gonna convert that alpha-acetolactate into diacetyl. It's going to be a lot more noticeable. Even if you have a low sensitivity to diacetyl, like myself, you're going to be able to taste it pretty well. So it's always important to check your beer, make sure that that conversion has been done and reuptake of diacetyl has been done before you cold crash and carbonate your beer. Contamination can also cause diacetyl. That's true for other off flavors as well. Definitely true for diacetyl. So if you have a really, really heavy level of diacetyl, it can also be caused by contamination by bacteria like Pediococcus. So that's something to watch out for. And then another, more recent issue is re-fermentation from dry hop enzymes, which we call hop creep, can also be a big issue here, because with hop creep, you're getting that secondary fermentation at a time when the yeast is not at its best. It's kind of stressed out. It's in a 6 or 7% IPA, and it's being given a little bit of extra sugar. So it's like, ugh, you already told me to do so much. Now you're asking me to do more. So you got to give it a little bit of a boost. Ideally, by managing yeast nutrition up front. But one of the issues here is that if that yeast is tired out and it's not able to properly get through that secondary fermentation in hop creep, it's going to be creating some alpha-acetolactate and diacetyl and not taking it up, which means that your IPA can have some residual diacetyl in it, or it can slow down that process significantly. And you don't really want to be sitting on your dry hopped beer with dry hops in it for very, very long, because every day you're risking losing aroma, right? A big part of those beers is freshness. So what causes diacetyl? Again, I sound like I'm beating a dead horse, but yeast health is the key to controlling off flavors in beer, period. Um, in particular with diacetyl, it's the yeast not having enough amino acids up front. It's under pitching, again, making that yeast work harder to synthesize amino acids, and also oxygenation as well. Poor oxygenation, again, yeast is going to have to work harder. It's going to have to synthesize more amino acids, and that's going to give you more diacetyl issues. The end result is a butter-like flavor. How do we control it? Number one is make sure your yeast is healthy. Do you sense a trend here? Although there are some solutions as well. So there are enzymes on the market. One is called ALDC, alpha acetolactate decarboxylase. This is actually not made naturally by yeast, but it's made naturally by certain species of filamentous fungi, molds. So there are products on the market that are extracted from those fungi that you can add to your beer. And what that does, what that enzyme does, is it takes any alpha acetolactate that is made in your beer, so secreted by your yeast, and it immediately converts it into acetoin rather than it being converted into diacetyl. And so acetoin is much less flavor active. That's one of the reactions that's actually happening inside the yeast after diacetyl is reuptaken. So it kind of shortcuts that process, circumvents it, and reduces the risk. So that's one option. I highly recommend that if you're a professional brewer and you're struggling to turn around beers, and get them to market. You want to turn around your beers faster, reduce your tank residency time. ALDC is one major way to help that. I wouldn't say it's not a solution to poor yeast health, but it is a way in combination with good yeast health to get faster turnaround times on your beer. And that could really, really add up in terms of dollars and cents. This stuff really does pay for itself. Okay, so that's diacetyl. If you want to learn more, you can always go and check some of our other webinars on that topic. We're also going to talk about phenols, and I guess it's pumpkin spice season. I'm not a pumpkin spice person. I know people are, so thought I would throw that one in there. Any fans of Dune out there? Phenols. Yeast, we don't always think of these as off flavors, and it all depends on the context. So phenols can both be beneficial or they can be off flavors depending on the beer style. Phenols are made by yeast. The classic example is what we call 4-vinyl guaiacol, or 4VG. That's that like clovey aroma that we get in a lot of Belgian style beers. They're made from precursors. So it's a little bit different from all of the other off flavors that I just talked about that are kind of just part of the main yeast metabolism. Phenols are more of a biotransformation. So when we talk about biotransformation, we talk about the yeast taking something that either has no flavor or has one flavor and converting it into another. Phenols, it's much closer to that kind of system. In this case, a lot of these phenolic acids that are in your grain are flavorless until they're converted to the phenol. So one example would be ferulic acid in your wort. When that's converted into 4-vinyl guaiacol, that's when it tastes like clove. If it stays as ferulic acid, it's not going to have a noticeable flavor. Yeast has specific enzymes to do this reaction. They're called PAD1 and FDC1. And in a lot of yeasts, those enzymes are inactivated. So many of the yeasts that we use to make our ales and lagers have inactivated phenol producing enzymes, meaning that they don't make these aromas. So it ends up being restricted to yeasts that are used for specialty beer styles like Hefeweizen or Belgian beers or wild ales and things like that. A lot of those Belgian or Saison wild yeasts tend to have those enzymes intact. So that is certainly a property of wild yeast. You can also get phenols from bacterial contaminations. You can also get phenols from bread contaminations. So if your beer is phenolic and you didn't expect it to be phenolic, that is one potential root cause is contamination. That being said, even when you're making an intentionally phenolic beer, one of the challenges here in terms of this being a beneficial flavor or an off flavor is that different base malts, different crop years, etc., different variables in the malt production can result in different amounts of phenol precursors. So you might even find if you're making Belgian style beers, for example, you might get changes in character from crop year to crop year. And part of that is probably differences in some of those precursors, or even just changing up your malt. So it's important, and that can make the difference between a beer that's, nicely peppery versus a beer that, smells like a clovey tire fire, right? So it's important to keep that in mind. They can add complexity to a beer, but they can also be undesirable or mask flavors. Like one thing that they do is some of those spicy phenols can mask some of the fruity flavors in beer. So if you're really like driving yeast esters, you might want lower phenolics if you're trying to get more of that fruitiness. So just to illustrate, oftentimes we'll even choose yeasts for beers based on whether they're phenolic or not. That's one of the ways that we at Escarpment tend to classify our yeasts. We have phenolic yeasts that are often used for like Belgian or Saison styles, not necessarily exclusively, but often, and non-phenolic yeasts that are often used for what we might call clean styles, or tend to work better for hoppy styles as well, although not exclusively. But that is one of the key differentiators. If you have the same yeast with and without phenols, it can be pretty radically different. So that's something to keep in mind. And just to illustrate how this works, it's not just ferulic acid turning into 4-VG. There's a few different reactions that make this whole thing a little bit more complex. You can control the amount of phenol precursors in the wort through not only through grain selection. Some grains have more or less of these than others. And there's actually a great page, I think, on the Milk the Funk wiki if you really want to dig in and find some of the data. I'm pretty sure that's been assembled. There's also processes in the brew house. So you may have heard of a ferulic acid rest. What that is doing is that is maximizing the extraction of ferulic acid. So that's important in a beer style like a Hefeweizen, where the yeast itself makes the phenols, but it's kind of on the weak end of the spectrum. If I go back to the yeasts, yeah, some of those Hefeweizen yeasts are especially the Weizen 1, for example, are a little bit weaker in the phenol production. Ferulic acid rest can help to maximize that if you're looking for more of that spicy clove, and that's really just starting your mash pretty cold, usually around 35 Celsius. Oftentimes, this also might show up in a professional brewery if you switch to wet milling, because oftentimes when you're wet milling, you're starting a little bit colder. It can be a more efficient process, but it also might change those precursors. And ultimately, you have these enzymes that are turning these flavorless precursors into different aromas. So you'll get all of these, I would say, in most normal Saccharomyces beers. The 4-VG is going to be your dominant flavor, but mid ferment in a Saison yeast, you'll probably smell the styrene. You get like a little bit more of like a plasticky thing from that, and same thing with the medicinal, the 4-vinyl phenol. You usually get that more from bacteria or bread. So if your beer is smelling super band-aidy medicinal, that's often indicative more so of contamination than it is from just giving the yeast too much phenol precursors. So how do you control phenols? Because it can be a pretty distracting off flavor in a beer. Malt selection matters. So I did talk about crop year and malt type influencing phenols. In general, malts with more kilning will have lower phenol precursors. So like a pale ale malt that's kilned more than a Pilsner malt will tend to have lower phenol precursors. I didn't mention it here, but just the same tip with those big stout barley wine type beers. More boiling in the wort will also usually reduce some of those phenol precursors. Avoid the ferulic acid rest if you don't want to release ferulic acid and therefore potential phenols into your beer. You can also have some of that carried over in Trub. So once again, Trub is one of the big ways that we can control beer flavors and beer off flavors. If you're working with a phenolic yeast and you want to downplay the impact of the phenols, you can select a temperature and a pitch rate for the yeast that optimizes your ester production. So knowing what the optimal temperature is for your yeast, and we've tried to provide some of that information. You can check out our first webinar in the series on yeast flavor and biotransformation if you want to learn more. And then another obvious one would be select a non-phenolic yeast. So if you've got a beer and you really don't like the phenols in it, and you're using a phenolic yeast, you can change it up, right? That is totally an option. So that's another thing you have to play around with as well. Cool. So we've covered some of the major off flavors. I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the other ones that come up. THP. If you're interested in THP, we have a whole webinar on this on our YouTube channel, so you can check that out. But I thought it was worth bringing up because it's also a pretty interesting off flavor, as opposed to a lot of these other ones they show up really in the aroma. As soon as before you even sip the beer, you'll probably notice a lot of those off flavors. THP is sneaky. It's usually showing up as an unpleasant aftertaste. More of an issue in mixed fermentation beverages. Anything that Brett or bacteria touch, it's going to be a much bigger risk, although it can show up in other beers. This flavor is caused by compounds that we just refer to as THP. It's actually a few different ones. And again, it's a little bit of a weird one because it usually shows up like after you swallow the beer. Basically, you have the beer reacting with your saliva, changing pH, and then things that were previously flavorless are now flavorful. And depending on what it is and how you perceive it, it might come across as Cheerios, it might come across as tortilla chip or corn puffs, or it might come across as mouse taint. And that's a term carried over from wine, but it actually can kind of smell like a mouse cage and be really, really unpleasant. So to each his own. I find it very unpleasant. And also, just like a lot of the other off flavors, different people are more sensitive to it than others. It's kind of a unique one in that it's a lot more prevalent in mixed fermentation, where we're using alternative yeasts like Brettanomyces, as well as lactic acid bacteria like Lactobacillus. And it's another one that's made just as a byproduct of metabolism. So in the case of Brett and lactic acid bacteria, it can be a result of them breaking down an amino acid. So just like our fusels, they're breaking down lysine in the presence of ethanol, and that's typically how we get THP. So hopefully that's one of the take-homes here with off flavors, is that amino acid metabolism is basically the central piece here. And if we can control that, we can control all of the off flavors. If you want to learn more about THP, there's a whole talk on that, so you can feel free to check that out on our YouTube. Another one I'll talk about is autolysis. I did my whole master's thesis on autolysis, so it's definitely something that I'm passionate about. I'm passionate about understanding how yeast cells die. But autolysis is also an important off flavor. It's a result of yeast cells starving and dying. So when yeast cells starve, they start to basically break down things in the beer, right? They will secrete enzymes and break stuff down. And if your hazy beer suddenly turns clear, or if your beer with amazing foam suddenly looks like a cider, that's probably what's happened, is the yeast has secreted proteases and broken down that nice haze or those nice foam forming proteins in search of keeping itself alive. So in terms of your beer, it's always important to get your yeast out of the beer when it no longer needs to be in the beer. Oftentimes we'll see cases where yeast is left in for too long. If the beer's done fermenting and the diacetyl's cleaned up, get the yeast the hell out of there for the most part. You can leave a little bit in for lagering, but that's about the only reason you would leave yeast in your beer post fermentation. The yeast does have some ways to sort of keep themselves alive without messing up your beer. So that's a process called autophagy or self-eating. Yeast can kind of just recycle stuff inside it. If you put your yeast cells under a nice microscope and you see like a bunch of stuff moving around inside the cells, that's what's going on. They're just like recycling. It's just like the recycling system in the cell. They're breaking stuff down inside, keeping themselves alive. But eventually they die. And that's when we get autolysis. So That's basically everything that happens after the yeast cells die. It can be beneficial, but in the case of beer, it's really not. I threw up the Kraft dinner there, or for the Americans here, the Kraft mac and cheese, because yeast extract is one of the key flavors in like pretty much any processed cheese flavoring. And if you actually got just straight yeast extract on its own, most people think it just smells like Kraft dinner because so much of that like processed cheese flavor to us is just dead yeast. So the more you know. I've ruined boxed mac and cheese for you forever when you realize that a lot of what you're tasting is actually dead yeast and not cheese, because cheese would be too expensive, right? But yeah, those are some of the flavors. It'll actually add a little bit of a bread crust, or can be rubbery. I often see that a lot with beers that have experienced autolysis. You get like a rubbery flavor, or just yeasty, which makes sense, or even cheesy. So definitely not something you want in your IPA, right? You really don't want a rubbery, cheesy IPA, I don't think. And you're tasting that dead yeast. You know, we want to taste the results of healthy yeast, not taste our dead yeast in our beer. So that's another one to watch out for. Easy to solve. Just get the yeast out of your beer once it's done doing its job. What are the best practices overall for controlling off flavors? Are you surprised that there's going to be a sales pitch for yeast nutrient? No, but seriously, healthy yeast. And it's a pretty easy problem to solve. Make sure the yeast has the right pitch rate. Make sure the yeast gets proper nutrition. So that is making sure that you're balancing the amount of free amino nitrogen that you get from your process and your malt with your yeast's needs. And you can always find more about that in our webinar on yeast nutrition deep dive. Avoiding contamination is important as well. That's beyond yeast management. That's the second major root cause of off flavors, is contamination. So that's something to also watch out for. And at the end of the day, something that's going to help you control and reduce off flavors is a complex nutrient that's rich in amino acids, as well as some of those important cofactors like zinc. So something like yeast lightning should help you with that process. Another one that I'll suggest is, if you worry about diacetyl, then a product like ALDC can certainly help you there as well. If you want to learn more, we've got a lot of information specifically to these off flavors, and also just in general on our knowledge base. You can also check out our blog. So Nate Ferguson from our team has been releasing some blog posts, and I did use some of his information for this webinar. So if you want even more information about fusels or acetaldehyde, you can find that on our knowledge base. So we got you. Then we got one more webinar in this series coming up as well. So next week, we're going to be talking about using beer yeast in a lot of other places, because I think there's a lot of really exciting opportunities with the unique traits of beer yeast. So we're going to talk about cider, seltzer, sake, wine, and mead. And we're going to be wrapping up this webinar series at that time. I don't think we're going to be gone for that long. I've got a lot of ideas, but I also do want to hear from you. What should we cover in our next webinar series? Always try to keep things in mind for what our audience of brewers is interested in. And that's it for me. Once again, I will remind you, for anyone watching live, ask some questions using the question box. I did see a couple come through on the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and answer those. But while I'm rambling about fan, probably, feel free to ask some questions using the question box on the right-hand side, and I'll get through those as well. And then we'll sign off. So I have a first question here from Lewis asking, so added fan at nutrient additions in wort over 17 Plato is also correlated with the formation of fusel alcohols? Question mark. If yes, and I'll say the answer is yes, it can be. If yes, what would be a good solution to add? What could be a good solution to add essential trace minerals such as zinc or magnesium without adding more fan? That's where I would look at those individual minerals. So magnesium's quite easy. You can add magnesium sulfate. Magnesium sulfate heptahydrate. It's a great option. Should be able to get that from pretty much any ingredient supplier. Epsom salts, otherwise known as. Zinc It's nice to have zinc, like in a complex nutrient, because sometimes if you just use zinc sulfate, it will precipitate with the trub. So, again, we talked about how important that balance with trub is. What I've seen some breweries do for zinc, if they're looking to add just zinc, is make a solution of, like a liquid solution of zinc sulfate. And the nice thing with zinc is you don't need a lot. Boil it up, cool it down if you want, and then add that directly to the tank. That can work pretty well to kind of adjust the amounts of zinc in there. Cool. Got a question from Diana. How long could it take for the yeast to start the autolysis process post-fermentation? Specifically for the reuse of yeast for more fermentations. Again, my general advice is once diacetyl is clear, get the yeast the hell out of the tank. It's not going to be happy there. It's not going to be happy sitting under a lot of pressure from the beer on top of it, sitting in that, alcohol environment in the bottom of a fermenter. If you're not going to use the yeast right away, I would harvest it into a yeast brink, or even just like a jug. Like we ship our pro yeast in these 10-liter jugs. You can clean that out and sanitize it and harvest your yeast into it and repitch it that way. It's an extremely simple way to repitch. It will be healthier in the jugs or in any yeast brink than it would be just sort of sitting in the bottom of the beer. And definitely it would be potentially causing less risk to your beer as well. So I know it's convenient to let the yeast sit in the cone until you need more yeast, but it's not necessarily the best thing for the yeast or for the beer. So that would always be my recommendation. And you will probably find that if you're cropping the yeast into a brink, and even if you're storing for a couple weeks in between batches, you're probably going to get better yeast health, and you'll probably get more generations out of that yeast versus if you're going cone to cone. Unless you're like batch after batch after batch, like where cone to cone makes sense is if you're cranking through beers and you've always got, fresh yeast that's just a day or two past diacetyl clear. Have another one from Lewis. Does the use of ALDC affect yeast metabolism by avoiding more NAD plus being regenerated? Does this stress yeast in any way, or do we need to have any special precautions to reuse that yeast? I'm going to go back to my slide. We've got a biochemist in the house. That reaction. Or that one. I would say if you're looking for reduction of diacetyl to regenerate that NAD plus, that cofactor, that's probably not ideal in general metabolically. There's other ways you can get that done further upstream. So I would say it shouldn't make an impact. And, ideally, if you're using added ALDC, it kind of works in tandem with the yeast, where the yeast is creating the alpha-ketolactate, which it's doing anyway. The ALDC just kind of takes care of it at that point. And then the yeast doesn't have to take up that diacetyl. It doesn't have to break it down. So there are certainly lots of other ways the yeast can regenerate the NAD+. So I wouldn't worry too much about that specifically. Mexico's coming through strong here. Love to see it. Got another question. I heard some people use boiled yeast as yeast nutrition. Is that a possible way to have cheap yeast nutrient and have all the nutrients covered with this measurement? The short answer is yes. The long answer is maybe. Yes, you can use boiled yeast or dead yeast as a yeast nutrient. There's a few things to consider here. So number one is, what did that yeast get fed with? If that yeast wasn't fed correctly, then it might not have the right breakdown of nutritional components. So when we look at, for example, yeast nutrient products like Yeast Lightning that are based on yeast extracts, we're making sure that it has that right mix so that it's consistent. If it's just any old brewery yeast, it might not. So it's important just to keep that in mind. Another thing is the yeast cell is surprisingly resilient and hard to break open. Like Okay, it dies if you boil it. Yeast cells die if you boil them. That's obvious. But the cells themselves can stay pretty well intact. Even, even a lot of the sort of cell guts and membranes can stay pretty well intact with a short boil. So, you might not get a super efficient extraction unless you're also playing around with shearing, like, blending, breaking apart the cells, or, other things like enzymes. But it can certainly work. I've heard of that working in a pinch. Um, there's a few brewers that I know of that are also putting spent yeast in the mash, which is another great way to. Actually, it works really, really well, because then you're basically just like giving it more time to break down than it would in the boil. And adding yeast to the mash can actually add some fan and some nutrient to the wort. So that's a really funny sort of arcane technique that actually has some scientific merit to it. So maybe we can do a blog post on yeast in the mash at some point. But absolutely, there are opportunities to use dead yeast as yeast nutrients. The caveat is that it might not be as consistent as like a product that you're purchasing. But it does work. Again, I don't know how we know this, but it came up, years ago, where a brewer approached me at a conference after hours and said, "Hey, Richard, what do you know about yeast in the mash?" I was like, "I don't know what you're talking about, but please explain." And he walked me through what some of the German textbooks talk about. And then I was interested enough and got a few brewers to try it. And we actually got some measurements. So I do know from that experience that, what was it? A kilogram of yeast per hectoliter of final beer produced something like 5 parts per million of fan. So yeah, it can work. Again, I would recommend a yeast nutrient, but in a pinch, you can get some nutrition from dead yeast. And we're seeing some interest in a webinar on hop creep. So that's definitely something that we'll put on our list for the future. I think that makes a lot of sense, because it's a common issue. I'm personally, sick of hearing about dry hops that take 2 or 3 times as long as they should because of hop creep. So I'm hoping we can help break that down, because there's some stuff that I don't think is necessarily common knowledge. I'm not an expert in hop creep. I'm definitely going to lean on some of the information from some of the people out in Oregon and California on that. But we have some ideas to help make it easier. And it actually starts with the mashing. So we can get into that and make sure that that's on our radar for the next series. One final question before we wrap up, from Jeremiah, asking, do yeast nutrient products have a shelf life? The answer is yes, they usually do. It's usually longer than yeast itself, but and it does depend on the product. Some of them are, if it's just like a blend of DAP and inorganic minerals, which some of them are, those will last a really long time without changing. A more complex yeast nutrient is going to be based on usually some combination of yeast extract and you might have some individual vitamins or minerals in there. If it is supplying vitamins in particular, there is a shelf life. Those will change or degrade over time. And then the amino acids can be a little bit less stable as well. So if you have like individual amino acids, it can be less stable. In general, though, because they're dry, like most yeast nutrient products don't degrade super fast. So I know on Yeast Lightning, like we can go up to 2 years. So just depending on how old the raw materials are when we get them, you might see one with a 2-year shelf life on it. So that makes that end pretty easy to work with. Most yeast nutrients will like go kind of clumpy and crusty before they actually go bad. Okay, we're going to wrap things up here. All right, thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next week. And feel free to keep suggesting ideas for future webinars, either in Crowdcast or on YouTube. Cheers, happy brewing.